Well, today is a great honor for the Institute and a great honor for our country to have an opportunity to speak to Robert Wilkie, Secretary of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. And one of the things we have focused on at the Institute over the last 30 years is getting you to see the world with new eyes. A lot of people have impressions of things that might be accurate or not accurate. And so I thought I'd start today with a little quiz for the audience as to see how you do before we talk to the Secretary. So here is your quiz today. Which of the following technologies and advances was developed by the VA researchers and scientists? As we step back. 1, the first implantable cardiac pacemaker. Or B, performed the first successful liver transplant. Or C, developed the nicotine patch. Or D, demonstrated that 1 aspirin tablet a day reduced by half the death rate from heart attacks. Or E, pioneer the concepts that led to the CAT scan. Or F, developed the Gleason score for prostate cancer. So which of those 6 was created by the work of the VA? So, well, starting in the audience here today in October of 2019, the Dean of the School of Public Health, Lynn Goldman, with her 7 degrees, has let us know the incorrect answer, that it's all of the above. Some of the additional VA advances and awards, range from 3 Nobel Prizes that were awarded in medicine or psychology. And the list goes on and on. So the point we really want you to understand today is the unbelievable advances to our society in the area of medicine, patient care that have occurred at the VA.
May I add to that?
You sure can.
And before we move on, I can't thank you enough for everything that you have done for the department and for veterans, particularly in the area of prostate cancer. That is the #1 killer of veterans. Over 15,000 a year in our department amongst our 9.5 million veterans. So it's an honor for me to be here, but I'm going to add to that list of accomplishments. I had this conversation with my counterpart in Canada, and I was happy to inform him that I had a closer relationship with the National Hockey League than he did because of research being done at Boston VA. Dr. Ann McGee, you've all read about the ongoing debate about safety in college, high school, college, professional football, and professional hockey, and the effect of sustained blows to the head on the lifespan of those athletes. All that research is being done by VA. We're not only doing it for the professional leagues, but we're doing it for the Department of Defense as they look at new ways to allow soldiers and Marines to survive longer in ground combat. So VA is continuing its cutting-edge contribution to the health of everyone on the planet.
Well, I think that's one of the keys, and it didn't start yesterday. U.S. government authorized the first medical facility for veterans in 1811. Today, 19.2 million U.S. veterans, 10 million of them get their care at the VA. 152 VA medical centers and 1,400 community-based outpatient areas. So if I ask you, Mr. Secretary, tell us how you see the VA, the culture of the VA. How are you approaching that today?
Well, you hit the right word, and that is culture. We have a unique culture that is born from the armed services of the United States. And I will further add to the history lesson by saying that 3 of the last acts of Abraham Lincoln's life were to sign the charters for 3 soldiers' homes in Maine, Ohio, and Wisconsin to take care of those who had suffered the most during what President Lincoln called the most pestilential of wars. VA culture, as I said, is born of the military. We've gone through ups and downs in our culture as the military has. And one of the things I will talk about is the perception of veterans by the country as a whole. I am the son of a severely wounded combat soldier from Vietnam. My father was allowed to recover from his wounds in 1970 for 3 years, and then went back to Fort Bragg, the home of the most decorated combat unit in the Armed Forces of the United States, the 82nd Airborne. He was not allowed to wear his uniform off post in the 1970s. And that wasn't Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Berkeley, California. That was southeastern North Carolina, the heart of Richard Nixon country. The Army was afraid of the reaction on the part of American citizens at the sight of that uniform during those times. It is my prayer that we never go back to those times. But as a result of that, VA has moved with the culture. We have opened up the aperture to include the entire United States, not only the citizens who are involved in promoting veterans, but also corporate America, to come in and be partners to help us help those 9.5 million who use VA services. And in terms of the advances that we have made, I'll just turn to the most recent Veterans of Foreign Wars survey. 90% approval of VA services amongst the membership of the 2nd largest veterans organization in this country. But the other telling fact is that 9 out of 10 members of VFW are urging those they know who are veterans who are not in our system to join. That is an affirmation of the progress that we have made just in the last few years. I will also note that the Partnership for Public Service, in my time in professional life, in the Department of Defense, in the White House, and then sometime on Capitol Hill, VA has always been ranked 16 out of 17 or 17 out of 17 in terms of best places to work. In the last year, we hit 6. And I've been told that we'll be higher when those new numbers come out in December. It is a new VA, it's an invigorated VA, and I can tell you that veterans across the country are voting with their feet because, going back to the cultural foundation, they want to be amongst their fellow citizens who speak the language and understand the unique culture of military service.
Mr. Secretary, I think for us at our medical foundations, and particularly the Prostate Cancer Foundation, the idea that a person would serve our country and not have access to equal care for cancer, other life-threatening disease, as you know, drove us a number of years ago to create this partnership with the VA so that if a person in the system was diagnosed initially with prostate cancer, then all cancers, then all diseases, they would not only be treated at the VA, but the leading cancer centers. So when you enter the VA, if you're in Seattle, you're also interacting with the Fred Hutch and the University of Washington, and we now see numerous veterans whose lives have been saved through advanced treatments, and hopefully that will occur. But I know these partnerships have not ended with us, and many of them have been created with the Chamber of Commerce, Walmart, and others. Could you spend a minute talking about those?
Well, let me start from about a year ago. The President signed the most transformative piece of legislation for VA since the GI Bill was signed by Franklin Roosevelt in 1944, and that is the Mission Act. I won't go into the crazy acronym. I will tell you what its impact is. Integrated Healthcare Network, tying this department in with the private sector, with companies like Philips, Walmart, institutes like yours, but also tying it into major hospital systems of the country, both private and academic, so that when that veteran needs that special care, we allow that veteran to go into the private sector if it is in the best medical interest of that veteran. We are not looking at the needs of the bureaucracy. We are looking at the needs of the veteran. That is why, as Mr. Milken said, we can have our veterans go to the most prestigious cancer centers in this country as part of the routine veterans getting care that serves their best interest. And I see the future as being one where VA is part of a spoke, several spokes of care: corporate, medical, academic, and then in terms of foundational and philanthropic support.
You know, it's interesting, Mr. Secretary, as I visit these academic research centers in the world today, but particularly in the United States. I was at one of the leading centers about a month ago, and they pointed out to me that the quality of care right now between the VA and this academic center, those that qualify to be in the VA, you know, actually have more access to new experimental drugs than those that are not. So I think really the world has changed substantially. Let's switch to data. We all recognize the importance of data. Computers are 1 million times faster. Data storage is 1/billionth of the cost that it used to be. And I think very few people realize the data that exists in the VA. I remember a good friend of mine, a Nobel Prize winner, Bob Fogel, who passed away a number of years ago. He was very focused on the medical records of the people that fought for the Union Army in the North. And initially, the cost was going to be $100 million to try to digitize these records, and obviously no one who ever fought in the Civil War was still alive. And the cost was projected at $100 million. With technology changes, when they eventually digitized these records, it cost $5 million. And so this data that you hold at the VA and historical knowledge is extremely valuable. How is the VA using this data today?
Well, it's part of an entire reformation that breaks out of what I would describe as the industrial age processes of the federal government. When it comes to prostate cancer and your contribution to the survival rates of our veterans, we are working with you and the Department of Energy in the use of supercomputers to collect as much data as we can amongst the veterans population. Our Million Veterans program does what you described your friend doing with data from the Civil War. I think actually it was Bill Gates who finished that work a few years ago. And in the Million Veterans program, we are looking at an entire life's history of that veteran. In addition to that, next year we will put online the electronic health record. So why does that sound revolutionary? My father, who was commissioned a couple of months before John Kennedy was inaugurated, and then left the service after over 30 years, jumping out of airplanes and suffering through severe wounds from Vietnam, carried around with him an 800-page paper record for the rest of his life. The electronic health record will use the best in technology, the best of the cloud, and will begin to be developed the minute that young American walks into the military entrance processing station, and then is handed over to the VA, so we know everything that has happened in that warrior's life. From the moment that warrior entered, any combat wounds, any exposure to toxic chemicals, and how that soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine progressed through his career. Super data. That is the key. And I would also add the promotion in our department of the use of artificial intelligence and robotics. We're at the cutting edge because of the academic affiliations that you discussed. If you look at our campuses, West Los Angeles, UCLA, Palo Alto, Stanford, Durham, North Carolina, Duke University, Chicago, University of Chicago. That is a partnership unlike any other in the world, and I will also give credit to my most famous predecessor, General Omar Bradley, who ran VA after World War II. His goal was to have every medical student and every nursing student in the country come through VA, through a residency, and to establish the permanent relationship with academic research centers across the country. And we are doing our best to fulfill General Bradley's vision.
Mr. Secretary, it's hard to let a week go by without thinking of the issue of mental health, not just in the VA system, not just for veterans, but for the country as a whole. Obviously, it breaks all of our hearts when we see that teenage suicides have risen by 56%. When we see the leading cause of death for policemen, firemen, and professions such as veterinarians, that this is the leading cause of death for people, particularly policemen and firemen, in harm's way. And we realize that every day we have 20 veterans who have committed suicide. One of the things that's most striking to me is that 70% of those veterans are not in the VA system. So whereas you have 50%, you have a much higher percentage of veterans. How are you dealing with this? We have a session here in October of 2019, right after this, on building a mental health system that we need. But this isn't just a crisis in the VA. This is a bigger crisis for veterans who are not in the system, and it's a crisis for America today.
Yes, sir.
How do you see us working on this area?
So let me have another moment of history. Benjamin Harrison, President of the United States, the only thing he's known for is being in between two non-successive terms of Grover Cleveland in the 1880s. But he was a general in the Union Army, and he saw death firsthand and in great numbers. He was very disturbed about reports he was getting from the Department of War and the Secretary of War about the number of suicide deaths in the Army of the United States. The Army started taking statistics on this in the 1890s. But this is the first time we have ever begun a national conversation on suicide. We have formed, for the first time, a government-wide task force, the Prevents Task Force, that brings together NIH, Indian Health, DOD, HHS, and HUD to start a national conversation that we should have had a long time ago. The other thing that is absolutely essential is the conversation on mental health. At VA, $9.5 billion of our budget is set aside for mental health. We have same-day mental health services. Just in the last year, we have screened almost 1 million veterans for mental health issues, focusing on the potential for suicide. And of those almost 1 million, we follow on a daily basis about 3,000. But my focus is not on the last tragic act of a veteran's life. If we just do that, then this is just another federal exercise that will end up providing doorstops in the form of federal reports that no one will read. If we don't look at mental health, addiction, and homelessness, this continuum of issues that lead often to this very sad event. So we think that because most Americans understand at some level what a veteran goes through when that uniform is put on and when the uniform comes off, we will be providing, through our veterans, an enormous public service. Last point, when I last testified in front of the Senate Appropriations Committee that day, National Public Radio and the Washington Post ran a story about a high school in Utah where in the last year 7 high school students in this small town in Utah had taken their lives. As Mr. Milken said, this is a national, and I would say Western, problem. It is a crisis in Western Europe as well. And I think we are not only working to ensure that we have processes in place to help our veterans, but we're working with the Congress and with institutions, non-governmental organizations, to help find those veterans who are not in our system. Last point. Most of the veterans who take their lives are from the Vietnam era. Let's put that into a timeline perspective. Lyndon Johnson left Washington, D.C. 50 years ago in January. That's how long many of these problems have been festering. And it's about time we finally address them.
Mr. Secretary, as a citizen, I can't thank you and the VA enough for what you're doing. And the pain is so great to think these people, these individuals that risk their life to protect us, have such depression that they lead to suicide. And we're looking forward to continuing to see what your work is, and obviously numerous of the centers of the Milken Institute, Center for Public Health, our School of Public Health, our Center for the Future of Aging, Faster Cures, and so on, are focused on working on this area. In closing, I want to point out that another area that people really often don't see the world correctly is the world of the nurse. This is the 200th anniversary of the birth of Florence Nightingale. Why is Florence Nightingale so important? She was really one of the leaders in data-driven care. And I think we don't fully realize, as a community, the contributions of the nurse and what the nurse responsibilities are and have been over time. I've lost more than 10 members of my family to cancer and had an intimate interaction with them. Anyone who's interacting with an aging parent today, as the population ages, not here but around the world, is more and often now interacting with a nurse. But the nurse of the 21st century is a data-driven nurse. Access to genomic data and others as she directs often the care of the patient. And we have been very focused on partnering with the VA on what is the prototype of a nurse of the 21st century. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I'm going to go back to military culture. Give me the statistics first. Of our almost 400,000 employees, we have 105,000 nurses. They practice at the top of their license. When I say military culture, I'm going to give a personal anecdote. My wife's aunt, Colonel Eva K. Tyler, United States Air Force nurse. Because of the traditions of the military and the traditions of rank, when Colonel Tyler walked into an operating theater in Korea when she was a major, or in Vietnam when she was a colonel, she was in charge of that operating room, not the doctors who happened to be captains. It was Colonel Tyler. Many of our nurses who come from that world are used to running the show. Now, with the inclusion of data, they are working in fields that in the past would not have been open to them in terms of their ability to pinpoint problems that need to be addressed amongst their patients. The other thing that is changing is that when we get those nurses from the armed services, they have experiences that most people coming out of medical schools or nursing schools in the civilian sector would have never had. So the modern nurse is the nurse who is in charge, the nurse who is making life and death decisions. And I think because of our unique set of circumstances. Again, that culture that is derived from the uniform. Our nurses are in situations that put them so far ahead of their counterparts in the private sector, and that is a testament to the wonderful work that they do.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and I think we couldn't be more excited at looking at the year of the nurse in 2020 and how the VA defines what are the skills and responsibilities for a nurse in the 21st century. So thank you for joining
Thank you for
us.
everything you do too. Thank you, sir.